Jonathan and I get a lot of calls asking us for help about the issues of doing a deal with Regulation D, Rule 506B. And we've decided that there are three words that our clients need to know about. Hi, I'm Gene Trowbridge, and I'm here with my partner, Jonathan Nieh. And Jonathan and I, in our continuing discussion of TBD, we just decided that this was going to be the TBD content about 10 minutes ago because it reflects some current calls we had yesterday. And in our work, we're going to talk to you about the three words that we think are important. And in building the watch here a little bit, in a 506B offering of Regulation D, which is where I'm sure, Jonathan, 9 out of 10 of our clients use 506B, right?
At least 90%.
At least. And in the nation, it's like 93% of all the private placements are in 506B. There's a couple issues. Number one, in 506B, you can take sophisticated investors up to 35. And Jonathan, before we leave this, we hadn't talked about this ahead of time because this is all TBD. Come back to me about the topic of integration, which we had a call on yesterday. Okay.
Okay.
In 506B, we can take 35 sophisticated investors because we're not advertising. So one of the questions might be, what's a sophisticated investor? And then the other issue is we can't advertise. So is there a defense for us against a charge of us advertising for clients? And so I'm going to talk about sophisticated, and Jonathan is going to talk about the two words that work toward our defense of being charged with advertising for an offering in 506B, which blows our exemption, and then we're in real trouble under the securities laws. Okay, so in 506B, we do get the benefits for capital formation of being able to use investors who aren't just exclusively accredited. We can use as many accredited investors as we want, and we can raise as much money as we want. But in addition to that, we can open up our fundraising to 35 people who are sophisticated. Now, sophisticated has a definition, and it's not very long, but I'm going to read it. It's right out of the SEC, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. A sophisticated investor is one who alone or with the help of a purchaser representative, or by reason of their educational, business, or financial experience, and here comes the important part, can reasonably be assumed to have the capacity to understand the fundamental aspects and merits of an investment in the offering. So we're looking to people that we know, and because we know them, we know that their educational, business, or financial experience, or that they use a financial advisor. What Jimmy Buffett uses Warren Buffett as his financial advisor, so we can use Jimmy there. But anyhow, the person we're dealing with in a 506B is someone we know, and we know enough about them in their background. And Jonathan will talk about how we know that that's the case. We know enough about them in their background to know that they can actually read the private placement memorandum, the operating agreement, the subscription agreement, and can understand the deal, understand the risks, and understand enough about what they don't understand to ask the sponsor questions and get all the information before they invest. Because the whole premise of the securities law in having to put our offerings in writing is to give the investor all the material facts ahead of time so that they can make an informed decision on whether they should invest. And so here we're looking at in 506B, making sure that people who aren't accredited, because by definition, accredited people are rich and smart to figure it out themselves. We don't even need to know if an accredited person is sophisticated. We really don't. We really don't care technically. But here's people who are not rich and smart. Can they understand the information? Can they determine for themselves what the material facts are ahead of time so that they understand the risk and decide what is, if this is a good investment? And just quickly before I turn it over to Jonathan, what's a material fact? Well, a material fact is anything you think that the investor would think is important for them to make a decision on whether she should invest or not. And there's no bright line on what material is. It's what does the investor think? So we can raise money from 35 sophisticated investors. And Jonathan, I think we have a lot of offerings where the majority of the investors are just simply sophisticated. I mean, you could, if you knew you were going to have 15 investors, you really could just determine that all of them are sophisticated and never worry about any of them being accredited. You could really do that. That would be fine. So there's the discussion of sophisticated, not a bright line, not a test, not as easy to determine as accredited, but do they, through their experience, have enough background to look at the documents and make a decision for themselves that this is where they want to invest? So that's one of the words, sophisticated. Jonathan, take it away.
So the other two words that we're going to be talking about are preexisting and substantive. And I guess kind of backing up, the reason why these two words are so important is because under Rule 506B, there's a ban on general solicitation. You cannot advertise your offering to the general public, right? And the defense for that, I guess, it's kind of like a safe harbor, right? To make sure that you aren't generally soliciting, is these two words: making sure that all of your investors, you have a pre-existing relationship with them, and you have a substantive relationship with them. So, pre-existing, what does that mean? Pre-existing to what? The rule is to make sure that you follow, to make sure that you're within 506B, it's pre-existing to the offering. And that's kind of confusing too, right? I mean, what is the offering? When does the offering start? There's a lot of dates that kind of get thrown around when you're doing a real estate syndication, right? So you sign an LOI, right, with the property when you're trying to acquire a property. Is that the date that the offering commences? Could be. You sign a contract when you sign the PSA to actually enter into contract to buy the property. Is that the date of the offering? That could also be as well. But I'm sure a lot of the people watching this and a lot of clients know that things change with the real estate deal, right? You might decide to do this yourself instead of syndicate. You might decide to wholesale it, sell it to some other party instead of syndicate. So in our practice, we kind of have a policy of, as soon as you sign with our firm, as soon as you sign our fee agreement, that's when the offering is being contemplated. And that's for sure when you need to, have that cutoff point, right? So once you sign with our firm, you know for a fact that you're going to do a syndication because you're hiring syndication attorneys. It doesn't really matter whether or not you sign the LOI or you sign the PSA yet. At that point, you sign with us, so you're contemplating an offering. So our policy for our clients is that's the date that you have to use, right? The relationship with your investors has to pre-exist to the date which you sign with our firm. Simple as that, right? It's kind of like a bright line rule that we kind of impose, but that's not what the SEC, imposes. The SEC just says pre-existing to the offering. So, Anything you wanna add to that, Gene? Did I miss
So,
anything?
Jonathan, yeah, no, I think the picture that I draw, I'm building my database.
Mhm.
I'm putting people in my database. And when I put people in my database, there's always a date on the entry of a person into my database. And this offering, the minute I sign the fee agreement, that's the date that I can go backwards and talk to people about investing. But anyone who comes in after that date, just by definition, doesn't have a pre-existing relationship. And so the easiest thing to do is kind of freeze your database. You're always building your database, but kind of freeze it for this offering at the day you fill out the fee agreement.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then, so for people that you meet after that date, I mean, you can't take them for this offering, but you could definitely, keep them in your database and say, oh, I might have a future offering later that you might be interested in. So it's not like you can't ever use that person going forward. It's just for this specific offering that you signed with our firm with, you can't take that person. You can't, ask them to invest in that deal. So moving on, the next word is substantive. In addition to the relationship being pre-existing, it has to be a substantive relationship. And substantive, first of all, what does that mean? It means, if you look at the definition for substantive, it means something of substance. It has to be, important. It's not just a trivial relationship. But luckily for me, the SEC actually answered this question. What does a substantive relationship mean? And I'm just going to read it, and then we'll talk about that a little bit. But the SEC said that a substantive relationship is one in which the issuer has sufficient information to evaluate and does in fact evaluate a prospective investor's financial circumstances and sophistication in determining his or her status as an accredited or sophisticated investor. Self-certification alone, by checking a box, without any other knowledge of a person's financial circumstances or sophistication, is not sufficient to form a substantive relationship. So kind of distilling that, I mean, like what, the reality of the situations that we see our clients in is, you obviously don't have to, verify their accredited status like how you do under 506C, but you have to take some steps to look at this investor's financial circumstances, right? To going back to the definition of a sophisticated investor, someone that possesses the knowledge or experience to understand all the risks in the deal. You kind of have to know this person well enough to know whether or not they're sophisticated. Basically, that's kind of what substantive means, right? I know it's kind of like circular logic, right? Like you have to know this person well enough to know whether or not they're sophisticated to invest in this deal, but it's I think one thing I always tell my clients, Gene, and I don't know if you do the same thing, is I just tell them to make sure that they're doing more than just talk to a person one time, right? It's more than just meeting a person and getting their business card and you met them at an event, so you just assume that they're well, you meet them at like a real estate investing event, right? So you assume that they have certain knowledge because they're there. You have to reach out to them several times to actually get to know them, to get to know their investing experience, whether or not they've invested in similar deals before, and also kind of like their education background, right? So where do they go to school? Have they taken real estate investing courses? Have they have they invested in other real estate deals before? That's kind of the advice that I usually give my clients. I don't know. What do you usually tell people, Gene?
Well, the first thing I get when I get into this discussion with the client is some resistance from the sponsor who says, I'm not a certified financial planner. I'm not a CPA. How am I going to figure all this stuff out? Well, sophisticated and substantive kind of work together. If you're interviewing, talking, getting to know the person toward the definition of being sophisticated. Is this a person who has enough background, has some advisors, so that if we go through this whole thing, they can understand what the offering is? And they know enough about us to ask us about our track record. What have we done? Will you tell me about your next offering? I think we're on the way to having a substantive relationship. I think it's a two-way street. I think you need to know enough about the investor to know, one, are they accredited? That's fine. Or they're sophisticated. And number two, do they know enough about you and have expressed some interest to have you tell them about your next offering? No bright line. Mm-hmm. And that's why some people do 506C. Not very many people do 506C because they say, I don't want to go through all that. I just only want to take accredited investors, and we'll go through a third-party verification to see if they're accredited. And I don't have to deal with pre-existing. I don't have to deal with sophisticated. I don't have to deal with substantive. Well, I don't know about that. Let's say an investor checks the box and says that they're accredited. Okay, good. And you have another question, and the question in the subscription agreement says that, the minimum investment here is $250,000. And after you make the minimum investment, how much money will you have left? How much cash? And they say $10,000. Well, that might be accredited. That might be a substantive relationship with them so that you know how much they have, but they're just not suitable. So a lot of it comes down to who's suitable to invest in your investments. So Jonathan, I think we've gone through those three words enough to the people who are listening to keep that in mind. And if you have any questions, of course, you can call us. But in the few minutes we have left, I want to discuss something that came up with Jonathan and I yesterday in our business. One of our clients came to us and said, I did 2 deals last month, and I'm going to do 2 more deals in August. And they're 506B deals, and I'm concerned about the 35 investor rule. Someone told me, I'm speaking for what the client said. Someone told me, Gene, that I can't have more than 35 sophisticated investors within a 6-month period of time in my deals. And if I do, I'll blow the exemption, which is 35 investors in a deal. And that's an interesting comment. And what Jonathan and I are worried about is that comment is running through this group, because in this group, there's a lot of communication back and forth amongst the sponsors. And I hope that isn't really what they're thinking. And so I was able to send him something that we have that says, the integration issue. There are reasons that the SEC would integrate different offerings into one. And here's an example. You go out and raise money from 35 people to buy some dirt. And then you go out and raise money from 35 other people to make the down payment on the loan to build the building on top of the dirt. Isn't that one offering? And there would be some argument that it is. There could be some argument that it isn't. But I would err on the side of caution that that's one particular offering. So if in that case, you really have 70 sophisticated investors, and you're in trouble if someone comes to look at your deal. But for our client, what he had is the last month he had 2 separate properties with 2 different loans, 2 different PPMs, 2 operating agreements. Sure, there was a lot of similarity, but it wasn't the same investors in every deal. Totally. It wasn't the same properties. it wasn't the same loan. So there are 5 items that go into integration, and 2 of them we just blew away with having different properties and different financing arrangements. So that would not be integration. And our client doesn't have to worry about the next 2 deals they're bringing out in August. And on top of it, there is a safe harbor. And this is what he, I guess, was referring to. There is a safe harbor that in a 6-month period of time, if you don't have more than 35 sophisticated investors in all of your offerings, it's a safe harbor. You're just fine. So no matter what, if you did, a number of offerings, but collectively you didn't have more than 35, you don't have to go through the 5-step process. It's just a safe harbor that we're not going to worry about integration. But our prolific syndicators will do a couple deals, 2 or 3 deals every 6 months. And so we need to know, and everyone needs to know, that we don't need that integration deal. Okay, so that's pretty good. Jonathan, we covered the 3 words: sophisticated, pre-existing, substantive. We talked a little bit about integration, which might have been in the weeds a little bit, but it was something that came up yesterday. And that's the whole process of TBD with TLG. So Jonathan, thanks a lot for this. And I want to tell everyone who's watching to subscribe to our YouTube channel. When you do subscribe to our YouTube channel, make sure you send us an email. We'll reach out to you and see how we can mail you a copy of my book, It's a Whole New Business, and maybe even an autographed copy of my book for subscribing. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place. Thank you.